Hi, I'm here today to make a tapping video about using EFT to work with the grief that can come up on the healing journey from chronic illness. So I'm just going to start tapping because it's just great to just tap. Tapping in itself can be beneficial as we start to touch on this topic of grief. So I know from my own journey of healing from chronic fatigue syndrome, there was layers and layers of sadness and grief when I was sick. And even after I got better, there'd still sometimes be sadness and grief for those years lost in a way to being ill. But they weren't lost because, of course, there was so much learning and growth that came through that time. And that's the other side of it, there can be almost gratitude for how much we've learned. But for today, focusing on the grief, because the grief is real and it makes sense. And I'd say it's one of the layers to getting healthy again, is to actually acknowledge the loss and to heal through that loss. So if you just tap the side of your hand, if you're not already, and we're just going to connect to, even though I have some grief about being ill or about having been ill, I love and accept myself anyway. Even though I feel some grief, sadness about the years lost or the months lost to this illness. How different my life could have been, would have been, should have been had I been healthy. I'm okay. It's normal. Makes sense. Even though part of me is grieving, I love and accept myself anyway, and I'm okay. It's a natural human response, a natural human emotion. And you can repeat whatever's working for you and just, leave the rest, or you can just tap along with me and connect to your system and where you feel grief in your body, in your heart, or where you feel it. So just tapping around the start of the eyebrow. This grief, this sadness, the loss of these years or these months to illness. Perhaps the grief that I'm not where I want to be now. The grief of going through a dip, going through another dip, perhaps. The grief, this grief, this grief. This grief, this grief, this grief, this grief, grief, this grief, this sadness. And just feeling into if your grief, your sadness had anything it particularly wanted to say. Then allow that part of you to share and why it's so hard. What have I missed out on at that time in my life that I've been sick, or that I am still sick? What am I missing out on? What am I sad about not being able to do, or not having been able to do for several months or even years? I'm really acknowledging the pain, the sadness and the grief. It really makes sense. And making space for that, honoring pain. You can stay with this as long as it feels right for you. Sadness and grief. Sadness and grief. Sadness and grief. Give it some space. The tapping. Bring your love to the grief. Bring your compassion, your care, your curiosity to this grief. Your acknowledgement, your acceptance. This is part of the journey. It's normal and natural to have grief. And of course, there may be other kinds of grief we're working with, and actually, it can be one of the loads that leads to chronic illness, can be grief, having actual had losses, personal losses in your life in some way. And then another layer of grief of being sick. You know, there's going to be so many layers of grief that we can carry as humans. You might even carry grief for your ancestors' pain. You know, there can be so many layers of grief. And for now, we're focusing on the grief to do with loss in this time of illness. It's really being care and compassion to yourself, the grief. Knowing you're not alone. Others have experienced this grief. The grief of the loss. Time of illness. Time of symptoms. So an invitation, if you're really with it and there's not more to process, for you to just pause this recording, keep tapping. Let's put some music on that can kind of hold you through the grief. And if you're ready, we can move towards just exploring for a moment also the blessings of this time, the gratitude, the learning, the growth. So you might say, even though there's this grief and sadness, there's also appreciation for everything I've learned. Put it in your own words. Even though there's grief and sadness, there is also some gratitude for all the learnings, the deep and rich learnings I've had in this time. Yeah, even though there's grief and sadness, there's also rich learnings and growth, and I'm a different person than I was before. And I wouldn't take that away. I've learned so much. There's grief and sadness, and I've also learned so much. I've grown in so many ways. I'm a different person now. I'm grateful for all this illness has taught me about myself, about the mind-body connection, about who I am and my more authentic self is, my truer self is. And consider the gifts for you. What have been your gifts on your journey? Perhaps you've grown in emotional intelligence. You can be grateful for that. Perhaps you've healed places in you never would have known were there if it wasn't for the illness kind of forcing you to go on a deep journey, deep soulful journey. Just taking what resonates, leave the rest, but just take a moment to be grateful for any blessings, any learning, any growth through this time. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for tapping with me today and making it to the end of this video. If you want to know more on my work, it's francisgoodall.com and also womenswellnesscircle.com. I'm also on Facebook and on Instagram as well as YouTube if you want to follow my work. And yeah, great to be in touch today, and thank you for listening and wishing you well.